Alrighty then. So, hello. Thanks for joining. My name's Melissa Coates, and we are going to talk about delivering and sharing content today. I work for a company called Blue Granite. I'm on the delivery team, so I spend my time doing customer projects and so forth. And of course, Power BI is a big part of most of our data-oriented projects these days. If you are interested in a copy of these slides, I believe they'll be available as part of the Power BI Days website, but they are also currently uploaded on my blog, which is at sqlchick.com. You can go to the presentations and downloads page, and you'll find a link to a PDF kind of near the top of the page. And on Twitter, I'm also at sqlchick, and on January 1st, I started doing something new. Every day I post something new or interesting about Azure to the hashtag AzureDidYouKnow. So kind of part of my personal effort to stay current. So if you're interested in that, that's something fun I'm doing currently. Today, we're going to talk about collaboration, sharing, and distribution. And so by the end of this session, you'll have a good understanding of what I mean by those three words. We're focusing only on the Power BI service in this conversation. And I'm going to follow the order shown here because it's how users typically discover things. They start with Power BI Workspace, then they proceed to sharing, and then they evolve to using App Workspaces and apps. So that's actually the building blocks that we're going to talk from. There's a whole bunch of things that are related to collaboration, sharing, and distribution that are a little bit more than we have time to talk about. So we're not going to hit premium, report server embedding, or data flows as part of this particular talk. This is where we're going to end up. So what we're driving at is to make the point of when you use My Workspace for personal purposes, when you use an App Workspace for team purposes, when you use an app for larger purposes, and on the far right, when you do and don't use sharing. So we'll revisit this way at the end, and hopefully it'll be crystal clear by then. The other thing I want to mention is that a lot of the diagrams that you're going to see today and some of the ideas that I'm talking about are straight from a white paper that Chris Webb and I published a few months ago, and you can grab it on the white papers page. So let's start with My Workspace. And by that, I mean the personal area in the Power BI service. And I'm going to be kind of jumping back and forth between slides and demo. So just to make sure that we're all clear, I am talking about the item here at the top of the list, My Workspace, where we would access our own personal reports and dashboards and data sets and Excel workbooks if applicable. This is something that even the Power BI free users have access to. So it's very much a logical starting point for anyone new to Power BI. So at the beginning of each of our main sections, we're going to see a diagram like this of kind of where it fits into the big picture. So here you can see that within the Power BI service, we're entirely focused right now on My Workspace. So the first thing to share about this really is to not store content that's critical to the company in My Workspace. It's a great place for having your personal items or proof of concept type items and so forth. It's invaluable. However, if someone evolves to having a lot of very, very important things stranded in My Workspace and then their job or their job role changes, that can cause a problem for administrators who have to get in there and rescue that content and move it elsewhere. And so really, this is kind of an education opportunity for companies that are building out their Power BI environment, is teaching people when to stop using My Workspace quite as much. While we're at this point, I want to just pass along a couple of small tips that will make things easier down the road with regard to sharing and distributing content. And one of them is about file names. So One thing that people tend to like to do, say in file systems, is they'll rename a file as versions change. And in the Power BI service, this would actually cause a big problem once there are dependencies on that particular file. So that's something that you kind of want to break people of trying to do that kind of thing. The other thing you might want to think about doing is having unique file names across your workspaces. So on the left, we're showing My Workspace, and on the right, I'm showing a Sales Analytics App Workspace, which we'll talk about those in a little bit. If we had a product sales analysis report that lived in both, that could absolutely be done. It just starts to get a teensy bit confusing for people trying to keep track of where they're at. And then if you start running a lot of PowerShell scripts and pulling data and you get the same names across workspaces, it gets a tiny bit confusing. The other thing that you'd like to get people invested in doing early is storing the original PBIX and Excel files in somewhere where we have version history available. So OneDrive for Business is often a really logical type of location for that, since versioning isn't currently built into the Power BI service. And then also with regard to where things are stored, if you're working in an area like My Workspace, if you are referencing a path that you and only you can get to for purposes of data refresh, that'll work. But as soon as you start getting other people involved, that becomes a problem. So if you adopt the habit at the get-go for storing your files in a location which would be the same for everyone, a shared document library, a shared file server, that sort of thing. All right, so what I want to do now is shift to talking about sharing. And so with regard to sharing, what we're talking about here is granting read-only access to individual reports and dashboards. And this is actually one of those words that gets tricky, because we could actually say as a general concept, we're going to share this report with you, but it's an actual feature in Power BI service, which comes with specific connotations. So for clarity's sake, what I am speaking of here is, let's say we wanted to share a report or a dashboard. There's the sharing icon that we see very prominently here on those pages. And if I were to go and view a report, the sharing icon is also way up here at the top right, very prominently displayed. So that's the piece that we're talking about. And if I were to hit this button, you can see that I can say, who am I granting access to? I can include an optional message. And over here, you can see that specifically access, this is my own personal tenant. So I have a fake coworker called Pro User that I have shared this particular report with previously. So that's the functionality that we're talking about here in this section. So the key thing here is that we're sharing one report or one dashboard with someone. So in terms of when to use sharing, as it was explained to me by someone on the product group, sharing is best suited to very informal scenarios where you're sharing with just a few people, such as your boss or a coworker that you work with very closely on a day-to-day basis. And we have other options we're going to talk to that are more geared or more well-suited to more broad sharing. And so the big reason why we want to keep this to those people that you work closely with, one reason for that is because we are sharing things on an individual object basis. And as you can imagine, that gets tedious to maintain. So we talked before about My Workspace, and we've shown how prominently those buttons are displayed in the portal. So this is where your users in the organization start because it's right in front of them. Of course, that's where they're going to start when they're going to start collaborating with other people. So the best practice that we have for sharing from your own personal workspace is to do that very sparingly. It's fine to do it with specific circumstances, such as, oh, you know what, I've got this really early version of a report I want my boss to take a peek at. Absolutely, go for it. But because of the things we talked about earlier, the rule of thumb is to use sharing out of My Workspace very sparingly. Now, an App Workspace, which we actually have not talked about yet, the App Workspace is just like My Workspace, but broader, and we'll talk about that more. But let's say I've got an App Workspace devoted to my sales analytics reports. If I want to allow read-only access, because sharing is always a read-only activity for the recipient, if I want to give just one and only one piece of content within that workspace to the recipient, sharing is where that's going to work out the best. And so essentially where sharing comes into play with an App Workspace is, let's say you have set up your security for the workspace itself and for the downstream app, which we'll talk about in a few minutes, but this one is an exception. That's when you want to start thinking about sharing. So it's the exception rather than the rule. There is, when someone does a sharing operation, the recipient needs to have a pro license, or the content needs to be in Power BI Premium. At the time that the content's shared, the person doing the sharing doesn't actually know, oh, does this person have a license or not? So just a heads up that it's going to work, and it's going to work just fine. And then on the other side, if the person can't see the content, they'll just get prompted to start a pro license trial. The other thing that's kind of interesting is that when you share a report, there are a couple of checkboxes, and the first one is to allow recipients to share your report. And that's actually checked by default. So my personal preference, you know, perhaps I'm just a little bit of a control freak here, but it seems to me that more often than not, you want to uncheck that so that you know, as the person doing the sharing, who all is actually seeing it. So kind of a heads up there to carefully control how you specify that option. And this is just a little bit of an oddity. So in Power BI Desktop, if we're going to publish our PBIX up to the Power BI service, as you see on kind of the far right of that screenshot, the publish option is actually on a menu section called share, which that's using sharing in a generic sense and has nothing to do with that sharing feature that we have been talking about. Now, with sharing, and we're going to say conversely when we get to talking apps in a few minutes, with sharing, as soon as you have changed something on a report or a dashboard and you've hit saved, the people that you have shared this with are going to see that change immediately. So if you're kind of working on something and, you know, save it, check it, save it, check it, and it takes you a little while, they're going to see all those intermediary copies. And so we have an alternative for that with the apps that we'll talk about here in a couple of moments. With regard to permissions, currently My Workspace is still all considered the existing workspace experience, V1, if you will, and then there's a new workspace experience that's currently in preview. The options for sharing, we have gotten one additional option for who you can share with. So when you do invoke sharing on a specific basis, we have a lot of flexibility. It can be an individual or a group, essentially. Within the tenant settings, there's a couple of options that would affect our sharing experience. The first one is to enable for either everyone or certain groups if you can share content with external users. And by external users, we mean those people that are, say, from a partner of yours or a customer of yours. They have their own Azure Active Directory. In your home Azure Active Directory, you have added them as a guest user. Then you can share content with them as an external user because your AAD understands who they are. So that's one option that affects sharing. And then the other one is this option to share customized report views. And what it means by that, so if I go inside of, I'm actually inside a report and not from the menu. This is the only place we see this. Notice that, maybe cancel out of this second. Notice that I've got, on my ugly little report here, I've got a handful of slicers that are selected. If I hit share, notice that there is, while I'm sharing from inside the report, this third little option that is, do I want to share it with what my current filters and slicers are? And that's what this option down here on the bottom right in the tenant settings is showing. Before I move on to the App Workspace, I just want to double check if we have any questions that have come in.
None so far, but I'm guessing people are rushing back to their keyboards after having fallen around, and they're typing all the questions now. I'll give them 5 more seconds. If not, we'll see it at the next part.
Sounds good. Yes, and if you have any, there's a chat window. Go ahead and pop those in there, and we'll get to them at a break or at the end for sure.
Okay, so Martin got back to his chair apparently, and he asks if others can see with whom content is being shared.
So within the Power BI portal, that's not visible yet. If we start grabbing data from the Power BI, or the Office 365 audit logs, that's where when a sharing operation is done, that will be logged as an event. So we could pick it up from the audit logs. And that's a good question if any of the Power BI commandlets in PowerShell show the existing sharing status, and I would have to double check if that is there. It might be, but I don't know off the top of my head.
Yeah, that's I do a session on monitoring, and I'm going to include this. It's
Excellent.
A good question, yeah.
It is an excellent question, yes.
Okay, well, that's it for now, so please do continue.
Okay. So next we want to talk about an app workspace. And here is where we think about when we talk about collaboration. So collaboration is the word that the Power BI product team uses when they say, I have someone that might edit a data set or create and edit a report or QA those results. I've got multiple people that need to work together. And so that's where an app workspace comes into play. Over in the Power BI service, we are talking about any of the areas under here that essentially aren't My Workspace. All other workspaces are an app workspace. One of the fundamental things that we like about an app workspace is, remember when we were talking about My Workspace, only one person can edit the content. Here we're truly talking about a group, and so it's a much better place for shared content to reside. So our diagram here looks very much the same. We have just shifted from showing, a My Workspace to App Workspace. And the focus here is on team collaboration. So a workspace fundamentally has one primary purpose and then a secondary purpose. So the primary purpose is collaboration, like we just talked about. So our user one kind of here at the top middle is publishing our PBIX report. At the bottom right, maybe user one's also handling the refresh schedule. User two might get involved and create some new reports from that existing data set. User three might do some QAing. You get the drift. So that is first and foremost the biggest reason that we would use an App Workspace. Now, secondarily, small teams, if you're saying, I want to just have my people in my group, for instance, go and view the reports and dashboards via the workspace, that can work just fine for small teams. So that's what we mean when we start talking about distribution. So distribution to the product team is more just about delivering reports. So more like the view-only experience as opposed to the edit experience, if you will. Now, the workspaces are going through a V1, V2 kind of change right now. The new workspace experience is currently still in public preview, and it's got some really big fundamental changes that give us a ton more flexibility with how we can actually secure them. And so the biggest one is the third one listed here. We can set the permissions now truly by individual instead of by everyone as a group. So if we pop back over here to this particular workspace, there's a couple ways I can tell that I'm in the new workspace experience. So one of them is it's just kind of telling me here at the top. If I go to my ellipsis over here at the top right and I go to Workspace Access, I can tell right away that this is a new workspace experience because I see my pro user is a member and my sales team is a contributor. We couldn't do this back in V1. It was like you're either an admin or a member and all members can either view or edit. So it's much more granular and flexible now.
And is there a known timeline on the general release of that? So non-preview for the new workspace experience?
Yeah, I have not heard anything about that. So this got launched fall time frame, I want to say. Maybe September-ish, if memory serves. So it's been in preview a few months. So I think we could guess, based on the speed that the team works, that it's probably going to be reasonably soon to hit GA or general availability, but I don't know.
Okay, well, my advice would be keep an eye on the roadmap that's been made public. That's
good point. Yes, yeah. Absolutely. Okay. With regard to those more granular permissions that we can set, currently we have 3 settings we can specify: admin, member, or contributor. There's also going to be a viewer role. It's not in the public preview yet, but they have promised that it will be there before it hits general availability. So if we revisit that thought that we had at the beginning of this section, that the primary purpose is collaborating on content, we basically have 3 roles to help us make that happen. And then that secondary purpose, when the viewer role comes out, that will help facilitate that small team distribution scenario that we mentioned a few minutes ago. And then the other thing with regard to the new workspace experience is now we have a lot more flexibility to use existing groups. So if you've got Active Directory groups that you've had for years in your organization, you can now take advantage of those in the Power BI service for securing content, which is a great, huge move forward that I think we're all excited about. So from a naming perspective, you want to create a new workspace. Being the naming convention queen that I am, my first inclination was to call something the Sales Analytics Workspace. But we're going to talk about apps here in a few minutes. The problem with including workspace in the name is that an app that you create later is automatically going to get that workspace name. And then it gets confusing. So just use a descriptive name that describes what's in there, but don't put workspace as part of the name unless you know you're never, never, never going to want to create an app from it. Now, with regard to purpose and scope, this is something that takes a little while to figure out. So this becomes a little bit like Goldilocks and figuring out which bed. So in column 1 here, if we set up a workspace that's for a whole department or a team, like all of the finance reports, this might be way too broad. It could be potentially even hundreds of reports, which would be just really difficult to manage. If we move to the next column, in only very rare situations would you have, say, just 1 or 2 reports that you want in a workspace, because that's too narrow. So, you know, the happy medium is usually something around a project or a subject area. So rather than all finance reports, maybe just the quarter end reports or something of that nature would justify its own workspace. When you're deciding what that happy medium is for you, the 2 biggest things that you want to think about are logically grouping the content and security. So it's a security boundary, just like very similar to like a folder out on a file system or a document library in SharePoint. Much the same thought process would go into deciding the scope of your workspaces. Now, another thing that can really help facilitate collaboration is when you start using a little bit more of what we would refer to as a hub and spoke method. So when you create your PBIX file, and most of the time you're importing your data set, creating your calculations, creating your reports, and you publish everything up to the Power BI service, and it's kind of all grouped together. What you can start evolving to is creating the reports separately, and that could be done either in the Power BI service through a live connection, or you can create them directly up in the web. And so that can really help if you've got multiple people collaborating that have different roles. One person works on the data set, another person works on the reports. That separation of the data set from the reports can really make things easier down the road as things grow in your environment. The other thing that I think would be naturally very intuitive, though, is to keep the number of people that can edit in a workspace to a fairly low number. I actually recently saw at a client site where there was about 60 people in a workspace that had permission to edit. And that to me feels like too much risk, that someone could go in and make a small change and maybe not realize that they're making a change that affects all 300 people that have access to that content, that sort of thing. Now the publishing process. So because inside the Power BI service, you can edit the report there if you have permission to do so. What that fundamentally means is that if you are initially published from the Power BI service, from Power BI Desktop to the Power BI service, and then you edit the report in the service, what happens when you go back to Power BI Desktop, make a change and republish again? Of course, you will lose the changes that were made directly in the service. So what the recommendation is to have kind of a standard practice that your team uses. Either you always publish from the desktop, or if you allow edits and new content from the service, kind of get in a habit of downloading that PBIX from the service before you go start editing in an old copy of desktop. A few current limitations in the workspaces. So they're flat right now. There's no folders. Although, you know what I'm seeing? This is not NDA information. I am actually seeing in the Power BI audit log now, it's always empty so far, but I'm seeing an audit record for folder name. So that gives me hope that we're going to see folders in the Power BI service soon. The viewer role, as we mentioned earlier, is not available yet, but it will be soon. And then content packs. Those are on a deprecation path. So if you have an investment in content packs, you want to start moving away from those and thinking about the new workspace and the app experience, because content packs will be deprecated here at some point. They're not formally deprecated yet, but we refer to it as being on a deprecation path because we know that they will be deprecated at some point. Now, another workspace limitation is that our related content is constrained to only one workspace. And what I mean by that is here I'm in my workspace. Let's say I want to create a new report. Well, what data sets can I choose from? Well, I can only choose from the 3 data sets that are in this same workspace. So that kind of can affect how you structure your workspaces, of course. And so we don't have it yet, but they announced a little while back, so I'm hopeful that it's coming soon. And to your point earlier, I should check the roadmap. There's a feature called Dataset Discovery that's coming soon that is going to allow us to do a few things. It'll allow us to reuse a data set across more than one workspace, which will be awesome. And that's kind of depicted down here in the graphic. And the other thing that it will do is, because what we want to do is we want to encourage people to create reports from data sets that already exist, right? Rather than creating more data sets that creates more copies of redundant data, more data refreshes, more copies of calculations to maintain, you get the point. So what this will offer is a way to mark a data set as being available for discovery, which means then I haven't seen what this will look like yet, but I would imagine that they'll be able to find more easily what this data set is and represents and connect to it to create a new report from it. And then there will also be an option to certify it. And so I think this will be really interesting functionality that will absolutely help the collaboration scenarios once we start seeing this roll out. And there is just one tenant setting that affects workspaces, and that is the tenant setting that basically enables that new workspace experience preview, because right now it's kind of an opt-in kind of option to say, do you want to create an old type of workspace or use the new preview? So that brings us to the critical juncture, which is, when do I use a workspace and when do I use an app? So we've talked about using a workspace for collaboration and distribution for small teams, but at some point we need an app. And we need an app when we start getting into those bigger teams that we're distributing content far more broadly. And so an app here is what we think of as our more formal method of content distribution. And by an app, I do not mean the mobile app. I mean a Power BI app. And users would discover it from the apps menu here. You could see that I have published a sales analytics app here, and you'd go into the app and view the content that has been published as part of the app. So that's kind of what we're talking about here, is this more formal method. So what that means is the content is published from an app workspace into an app, and then all those users that are in a view-only type of mode consume that content from the app instead of from the workspace. So why do we like this? Well, there's a couple of key reasons. So one key reason is that we can manage what content gets published in a read-only way so much easier. So if you look at the screenshot on the left, you can see that I've got 5 reports. 4 of the 5 are going to be included in the app. So when I, shown in the bottom right screenshot, if I just update the app, automatically all 5 of those reports, or excuse me, 4, are going to be included in the app. As opposed to earlier, remember when we were talking about sharing? Share report number 1, share report number 2. It gets very tedious. So we can manage this so much easier. So for that reason, the general rule then, when we're in this type of scenario, is that people have access to the workspace who are doing authoring, development, testing kind of work, the collaboration. And then the distribution is all handled via the app. And that's where we involve a much broader set of users. Now, the other big reason that we like the app, remember how we said that you publish the content from the workspace to the app. So what that means is I can be working in the workspace and I can be changing my report and going back and forth for hours at a time, getting it just right and continuing to save. And none of my people that get the content through the app will see that until I republish. And that applies to changes to the reports and the dashboards. So that's awesome. That's a way big advantage over the sharing that we talked about earlier. Now, there is one caveat to know about, though, is that your data set changes do always take effect immediately. And on one hand, that makes perfect sense. We do data refresh on a schedule, right? Of course, we want our people in the app to see that refreshed data without having to republish the app, of course. But what comes along with that is if you are making changes to the data model or relationships or calculations, and you save that in the data set, those are also actually immediately impacting the app. So that's just a thing to kind of be a little bit careful of, because something in the data set could represent a breaking change that happens right away when the report and the dashboard haven't changed yet, because those are triggered on a republish. There is one tenant setting that is pretty interesting that is associated with apps, and it's called push apps to end users. It's by default, it's disabled. And the reason that it's disabled is because if anybody and everybody in the organization could create an app and push it to anyone that they want, when you go into your apps menu, this one over here, that we were looking at earlier, things just start popping up. And if you're in a big place, that could get to be overwhelming and even frustrating and annoying. And so it's really nice functionality, but it's a good call to not allow anyone and everyone to do it, but for certain groups of authors. So for instance, I've got a customer that has a workspace for sales reporting, and there are hundreds of people in the sales organization. Pushing that app so that simplifies where you tell people to go retrieve the content is a great convenience for users. So used in the right way, it's a great feature. All right, so let me just kind of recap where we've been briefly, and then we'll see if there's any final questions. So what we've kind of talked through this conversation is, on the left, we've got our content and our data. And if we publish to My Workspace, that would be appropriate for personal BI, business intelligence kind of scenarios. If we publish to an App Workspace, as shown in the middle, that would be our team collaboration or maybe some small team distribution kind of scenarios. We could publish an app from that App Workspace if we want to start invoking more large team content distribution. And then on the far right, from either type of workspace, we could do some individual sharing of individual pieces of content when it makes sense, that being the exception rather than the rule. So the other thing before we turn it over to Q&A that I would like to point out, or at the end of these slides, are some comments about some other sections that I didn't have time to cover in full. So a few things about when to use premium or report server, etc. And then some comments about just other content delivery options and some things to think about when you're talking about subscriptions and live connections and etc., etc. And then lastly, the thing that I really want to point out is this final section, and this is all straight from the white paper, so there's more conversation there too. But if you have apps that you are handling multiple dev, test, and production environments, there's kind of a couple different ways that you can approach that. I have one customer that likes to keep this as lightweight and easy as possible. So they consider their App Workspace to be development, and they consider the published app to be production. And that is as lightweight and easy of a solution that they are comfortable with. And then you can start introducing separate app workspaces for dev, test, and production to start really, scaling that and providing more flexibility, with the trade-off that of course there's more complexity. So option 2 is basically just showing this from a perspective of you would manually publish the PBIX to each environment. And then option 3 kind of takes that one step further and says, well, I'm going to have some scripts, and I'm only going to publish the PBIX to dev, and everything else is going to be handled via scripts. And so there's that I kind of wanted to point out. So let me put this back up so that you've got the location of where to find these slides if you would like to. And with the time we have left, are there any other comments or questions?
Yes, there are.
All right.
I kept them to the end because you were still talking about the apps and the workspaces, but people are wondering if it is possible to pin content from different workspaces to one dashboard or app.
Oh, not yet. Not across workspaces, but I think that with the vision, we're in the early days still of the V2 workspaces, or that new workspace experience as they call it. I think we're in the early stages of that now, with the dataset discovery starting to be able to cross that boundary. I suspect that in the future we might have that flexibility to pin content from multiple things to a consolidated dashboard where the tiles span where they started from. So that's kind of a guess right now, but I would suspect, because that's kind of a common thing that people would really like to do.
Yeah.
But not now.
Been hearing that as well. So Maral has an issue where their Power BI workspaces are viewable from the standard Office 365 portal. When you create a workspace, it pops up over there as well. And
Yep.
Maral is wondering, is there a best practice for a clear indication of a workspace being for PBI purposes? And you, as a naming queen, I think you're the best person to talk about.
Yeah, so that is kind of a tough one, because you're right. If we were to create a new workspace, if I don't choose this preview at the top, we would be creating not only the workspace here, but we would be creating an Office 365 group, and we'd be creating a email account and a OneDrive and all these extra things. And there's some organizations that love that. More organizations think, whoa, now my Office 365 groups are out of control, which is, I think, perhaps where this question is coming from. I think perhaps the best direct answer I have would be, if we name it something like sales analysis, Power BI reports, something that indicates it's for Power BI. I think if we put reports in it, though, it's, then reports is in our email group and our OneDrive, and so that would be kind of a bad idea. Even putting Power BI in it makes it confusing from those other aspects. So I think what you will be really excited about then is the fact that the new workspace experience means that no longer does it create the new Office 365 group behind the scenes. It's now completely decoupled. So if you wanted them to both exist, it would with the new experience be a two-step process. So I think that you're probably just going to want to end up moving everything to the new workspace experience and maybe even retire a bunch of those Office 365 modern groups that got auto-created along the way.
Yeah. So it brings us to the next question, which is a nice tie-in. A lot of people are still on the V1 workspaces, and knowing some companies, they are unlikely to move quickly because they have a backlog of other stuff to do. And Rishi is wondering, with the current limitation of the one-to-one mapping between workspaces and apps, what is the best way to have a matrix of access to all of those things? So some people accessing all reports and only some selected ones, without having to publish the report to multiple workspaces.
Yeah, and that's a big challenge right now, because something that's a common need is, let's say you might actually want one data set, and then maybe you've got 10 reports, and maybe 3 of those reports would be delivered to all 3 groups of people. Another couple of reports are suitable for one group, and then the other reports are suitable for another group. We cannot do that effectively right now. So unfortunately, right now, what ends up happening is a data set gets replicated in multiple workspaces just so that we can release it downstream to different groups of people, and that security matrix is easier. And so yeah, it's kind of either sharing or separate workspaces and separate apps right now in order to kind of find that happy medium is unfortunately kind of where we're at right now. So that being able to cross workspaces later, or if at some point we can ever create more than one app from one single workspace, that would be a really nice thing, but we just can't do it now.
Yeah, I get that. So let me see what else we have. There's a lot coming in. So this is a good one. I have no clue about this because I have no experience with it, but are all of these features going to be available in the PowerBI.gov space at the same time, or will there be a delayed rollout? Do you have any experience or knowledge about that?
I haven't worked in a government project. I've got a friend who has, and so she's given me a little bit of information. There are some differences in the government tenants. And then I think I have also heard that a lot of times if something new comes out, it hits government, say, the next week, is another thing that I've heard. But you're right, though, that there are some features that are not always available in Gov, or they act just a smidge differently. But I don't have any specifics on that because I haven't dealt with one of those projects directly.
Yeah. Okay. So regarding the workspace limitations, will you actually be able to publish a report in one workspace from a dataset in another workspace, and in the new report dataset allow users to build reports without being able to access the initial dataset?
I think you would still have to be able to access the initial data set. So this scenario here that we mentioned earlier, I think you would still have to have permission in order to make that happen. But that this is a future feature that I haven't seen directly yet, so I don't have a lot of information yet about how that's going to work.
Okay, yeah, I guess the same. But let's get it going to the next one. This is the second to last question. If Andres, for example, has 300 users using the same report, all with Power BI Pro licenses, could he face any problems, or would the users have slow performance when querying in the report?
Not that I am aware of.
So is it, well, I'm guessing with the public spaces, you have premium where you have your own space, you might run into problems. But does public have a limit on CPU usage and RAM usage and stuff like that?
So where that gets tricky is that, so premium is usually where we start looking at when you say, I've got so many users that are read-only consumers, and I don't want to buy pro licenses for all of them. So I think if memory serves, about 500 is approximately where the financial tipping point starts to be. So usually we start looking at premium for licensing cost effectiveness.
Yeah.
But the question was more about performance. And so when you buy premium capacity, you do get your dedicated vCores. So, you've got dedicated CPU and memory for the front end and the back end. And something that I have heard is that customers have been moving content into premium thinking that they're going to get better performance, but because then it's no longer elastic in the sense that your premium capacity has a fixed amount of resources, performance is not the reason to consider it premium, right? And it's more about the fact that you've got the licensing cost, or you want to get different features, right? You want to have your larger data set sizes. You want to have incremental data refresh. You want to integrate your reporting services reports, that kind of stuff. So performance hopefully doesn't get worse unless you over provision your premium capacity, but it can happen.
Okay. So Rishi is wondering about something that I think will be a completely different talk, but maybe you can say something about it for a minute. What's the best approach in your opinion for DevOps between dev, test, prod workspaces? And he's imagining there's a PowerShell script for that.
Yeah, there is. And there's some APIs where basically what you would do is you would extract all of the content, and I mean data sets, reports, and even the dashboards from a workspace. You would basically export them and then turn around and re-import them to the other workspace, the destination target. The one thing that, unless something has changed recently, that cannot be fully automated in this end-to-end is I don't think we yet have PowerShell commandlets to republish an app. So unless something has changed recently that I missed, that's the one piece that kind of still needs to be done manually and can't be set up automated in a full DevOps kind of way.
Yeah.
Feel free to expand on that because I know that's your area.
Well, I did a talk on it at SQL Relay. Dashboard publishing wasn't available back then, but with the pace that everything is growing, I suppose it is available. And if app deployment wasn't available yet, just like you, I'm guessing it will become available very soon, because you just need to have that. But yeah, it's talking to the API. The biggest challenge I have for this is getting the permissions to set up a Power BI app with the right permissions to access the API. That's always
Oh,
relaxed.
yeah. I spent a lot of time the last few months with some stuff with PowerShell and the APIs, and whew, yeah, fun times. Um, so yeah, right. That's a whole nother talk for sure. The only other thing that I'll provide as a little bit of a heads up is the there's a script online to download all the content from a workspace, and it's gotten a little bit aged now to where a couple pieces of it would need to be updated. So just kind of watch out for that. It's still a good start, but because it's aged some, and as you know, the only constant is that everything changes so darn fast all the time. So just kind of watch out for that and plan to fine tune that a little bit if you
Yeah.
start from it.
Well, I know DevScope is very active in that space with Rui Romano leading the charge there. Craig Porteous from Scotland, the Data Scotland conference, he's active in that space as well. And they all publish to GitHub, so just look it up and you'll find everything online. And other people are saying, thank you so much for explaining this. They're very happy. You explained it clearly what PBI sharing is about. Maral says, thank you, wonderful work. And you apparently tailored your session completely for Maral. So thank you for that.
Well, thank you. You all have a great rest of your day then, and thanks for having me.
Okay, thank you for doing this. Talk to you later.
You're
Bye.
very welcome. Bye-bye.